In this chess lecture, I'm going to go through the game Fischer versus Larsen, which was played in Denmark in 1958. And this is the first lecture that I'm titling as an advanced level lecture, which is USCF 1500 and above. But I love this game, and I think the chess is different from piano and other musical instruments in that you have to study chess for a while before you can really appreciate it. Whereas if you just go to a concert and you can see someone play a musical instrument, you can appreciate it right away. But I think that Bobby Fischer's games are kind of like the Mona Lisa. I think they're kind of works of art, and we need more chess lectures about his games because they're really cool. And this game has I'm going to use Bobby Fischer's analysis and then add a little bit of my own, but this game has a lot of variations. So there's some lines that are variations that are 10 moves deep. So that's why I'm putting it in a different category than the rest of the videos. So, and I'm going to do my best to go through them accurately. So Fischer's playing white. And now this game is really a significant game because in high-level chess today, the dragon is not as popular as it used to be, and this game is one of the reasons for that. So Fischer has a famous quote, which is talking about the dragon. He says, "You just sacrifice, sacrifice, and checkmate." So I think this is the game where he came up with that. So Fischer is playing white, and Larsen, who's also a grandmaster, is playing black. Fischer mentions in this position, the knight g4 loses the knight to bishop check. So the knight blocks, queen takes knight, and knight c6, knight takes is destructive. This is all common theory, just the beginning of it. And bishop c4. Now, Fischer, he mentions, okay, castles leads to d5, which I just want to go through a little bit more of the analysis of that, so you can see why the move d5 needs to be prevented, because it's a great equalizing move. So that's why bishop c4 is played, but I think it's the variations from these lines are pretty cool, so I wanted to go through them. Okay, so now in all general Sicilian positions, if black can play d5 successfully, then black is generally equalizing, because the d6 pawn gives a little bit less space than the e4 pawn, so white has a slight advantage with their better space, and just the fact that they move first in the beginning of the game. But pawn to d5, generally openings that are bad against the Sicilian allow this pawn push. And bishop c4 is way more overwhelmingly played move 9 instead of castles queenside. But d5, now knight takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, knight takes, knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes. Now this is the variation that theory had worked out. The key move here is queen to c7. Well, obviously if queen takes d5, rook takes d5, white is just up a pawn. There's no point in playing that move. But after queen to c7, queen takes a8, challenging sacrificing the rook. Bishop to f5, exclamation point reveals a discovered attack on the queen, and also threatening checkmate. So in this position, queen takes f8, and now king takes f8, and I think king takes f8, and now something like bishop to d3. This is just a really good position for black, and it's going to be pretty deadly. We have the move queen. I think this is immediately winning queen to e5. I don't think bishop d3 is the best move, but queen to e5 hitting b2 and the e3 bishop, and I don't think there's any way to save the white position here. So maybe bishop d3 is not the best move, but either way, this variation is was proved to be pretty good for black. So that is why, after all of this, that the best move was shown to be bishop c4 in this position. So now Larsen plays knight takes d4. And now Fischer goes through, one possible idea is a5, which I'm not quite sure. Fischer gives the variation g4, knight e5, bishop e2, d5 question mark, g5 wins a pawn. That was one of the less interesting variations Fischer gives. But the move played in the game is knight takes d4. I think when you have a little bit less space, you want to trade, and also this allows the bishop to come to e6. And this was one way the dragon, I think, used to be played a while ago. And now Fischer plays bishop to b3. I think a bishop takes e6, pawn takes e6. The d5 square is controlled, and the knight can't go there, and the f-file is open. This pawn is not too easy to attack, so I think black will be happy with bishop takes e6. And now queen to a5, and Fischer castles queenside. And now pawn to b5. King to b1, pawn to b4, knight to d5. Fischer said knight to d5 is stronger than knight e2. After bishop takes b3, c takes b3, rook fd8 is a little bit less good for white. So knight d5, pressuring on f6 and threatening to capture. Bishop takes d5 is played. Fischer says the worst move is knight takes d5. After bishop takes g7, king takes g7, e takes d5, bishop d7, rook d to e1 with more positional advantage. Fischer calls it a crushing bind. And this was a game played by Korchnoi in 1953. He played the black pieces. Bishop takes d5. Bishop takes d5. Fischer said it was stronger to play e takes d5 after queen b5 with the idea of pushing the a pawn. Rook he1, a5, queen to e2, and not being afraid of a queen trade because of this positional advantage of the open file and the e pawn and the space advantage, I think. And that was a game. The queen e2. Queen e2. My mistake. Forcing a queen trade unless they're going to sacrifice the pawn. And this was a game where Ta was playing the white pieces. In 1959, which just gives up the attack but goes for the e pawn. So bishop takes d5 was played in the game. And now, okay, now, to be honest, I don't understand this. Rook a c8. Fischer says this was the losing move of the game, which is still beyond me after studying the game, how this was the losing move, but we could go through what he says. So Larsen, later after the game, said he was playing for a win, so he rejected knight takes d5, bishop takes g7, knight c3 check, bishop takes, oh sorry, if b takes c3, but if bishop takes c3, b takes c3, queen takes c3, queen takes c3, b takes c3, rook c8, and white's up a pawn, but this pawn is going nowhere and is about to be attacked. So instead of bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, rook a to b8, c takes b4, queen takes b4 check, queen takes b4, rook takes b4, bishop b2, rook f8, and the bishop is won back. But either way, Fischer said in this variation after knight takes d5, he intended to play e takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes b4, keeping the game alive. So, and I wanted to put this game up because it is really hard to go through this in a book, and I think just putting it up on YouTube makes it a lot easier to see the analysis than to go through it in a book. So after rook a to c8, Fischer plays this move, and he gives the exclamation point, bishop to b3. Now white has the two bishops, and as after this move, he gives this famous line, pry open the h-file, sack, sack, mate. Rook to c7. If queen to b5 to try to push the a pawn, then bishop takes a7. And it's even harder for black to get a breakthrough. So rook c7. Fischer plays h4, queen b5. And now these variations I think are fascinating, which is the defensive move h5. And I'm not sure how much of this he calculated in the game, but I think it's good analysis. g4, h takes g4, and now if instead of taking, rook fc8, rook dg1, h takes g4, h5, and now this move I think forces h takes g4 because if it were ignored, then I think let's see, like let's say queen b5 were played in this position. Bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, pawn takes pawn, and rook takes g6 is now threatened. But then this is definitely a losing position for black. So h takes g4, h5, g takes h5, f takes g4, knight takes e4, queen f4, leaving the bishop hanging but threatening on f7, e5, and now, okay, bishop takes d4, queen takes f7, king h8, This is not checkmate, but will be in just a few moves. Queen takes, check, here, check. If king here takes, this is a mating attack. And king here, this is mating as well. So that's mate. So queen, so bishop takes d4 is not playable after queen f4, but e5, queen takes, and now this defends the pawn with the rook. Queen takes e4, e takes d4, g takes h5, king h8, h6, bishop f6, and now I'm sure you didn't see this all in the game because that would be superhuman, but rook to g7 is winning. And now Fischer does not give the rest of the variations, so this is, I had to work this out myself. If bishop takes g7, pawn takes g7, king takes g7. Okay, this is just mate. Let's see. So forgetting what I figured out. Rook h7 check. And queen h7 check. Okay, so if king f6 check. Here this is mating. Here check. Here mate. So we went through king e5 leads to mate, king g5 leads to mate, king e7, rook takes check, and now here this is mate as well. So that leads to mate. So king f8 is forced to be played, and now after rook to e1, I don't see a defense stopping queen to h8 mate, and I think this forces mate as well. Yeah, it doesn't. Let's see, queen to g5. Oh, Oh, I guess I made a mistake. Queen to f8. Let's take a look. Check here. Check. And here. Check. Here. The king is beginning to escape. So we could try rook h7, king f6. See, this is why this is very difficult. Because I thought this is what my analysis was before, and I thought I had missed queen g5. I thought that led to mate. See, check here, check here, check. This does not seem to go very far. So, well, if you find the answer, you can post it in a response video or as a comment. But let's just see. think I also looked at rook g1 check. King f8. And I can't seem to find it right now, but for the sake of the video, I will go on. This was one variation in the line. So after h5, g4, we also, Fischer then looks at the main move. H takes g4, h5, g takes h5, and now he gives the side variation. Knight takes h5, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, f takes g4, knight f6, queen h6 check, mates. So g takes h5, f takes g4, knight takes e4, and he gives a side variation. H takes g4, rook d to g1, e5, bishop e3, rook d8, bishop h6. And now we could go analyze a few moves further. Let's say king here takes, check, this mates. So after king f8 takes, this seems like the only move, which is obviously losing. And also the move he analyzes, knight takes g4, rook d to g1, bishop takes d4, rook takes g4 check, exclamation point, queen h6 forces mate, no defense. This time stop queen to h7, rook e8, check, mate. So Fischer is very good at analyzing these variations. So knight e4 is the main analysis of the main variation, the main line of this variation, and queen e3, attacking the knight, knight f6, and he also gives bishop takes d4, queen takes e4, the bishop still being threatened, bishop g7, rook takes h5 with a double attack. So queen e3, knight f6 is played, g takes h5, e5, and h6 wins. Pawn takes, queen to g3, I believe is winning. Knight e8, pawn takes, knight takes, rook to g1. Well, let's see, rook to g1, queen e5, queen h4, and now I don't believe there is a defense here because the knight is pinned. So just some extra variations to add into Fischer's analysis. But I think that's an important move to go through. but I really don't know how much he saw in the game. So queen b5 was played. And now the idea is to get the pawn pushed to a4. Fischer plays h5 exclamation point. He says there's no need to lose a tempo with preparing h5 with g4. And Larsen plays rook fc8. Now we go through g takes h5. Well, first, if knight takes h5, I believe bishop takes. And now if king takes g4, knight f6. I think this is a classic Sicilian dragon checkmate. A way to get checkmated. G5, hitting the knight, which defends h7. Knight h5, rook takes, pawn takes, and I believe this forces mate. Let's see, after rook f8, not rook takes because of the mate on f1, but queen takes, threatening f7 as well, and I don't believe there is a defense here. But Fischer does not go through this. He only analyzes, I think because this is assumed, g takes h5, and he gives the analysis g4, h takes g4, f takes g4, knight takes e4, queen to h2, knight g5. I mean, this game really makes you just want to give up if you play anything other than e4 and just start playing the Yugoslav attack. By the way, White's opening is called the Yugoslav attack against the dragon. Bishop takes g7, king takes g7, rook d5, rook c5, queen h6 check, king g8, rook takes g5, check, rook takes g5, queen h7 mate. So after queen b5, h5, rook fc8 is played in the game. H takes g6, and we notice the pin, so the only move is h takes g6 and g4, and now Fischer says bishop takes f6 would be a mistake. After bishop takes f6, queen h6, e6, and there's no checkmate because the bishop is blocked and the bishop controls h8. So Fischer plays g4. Oh, I'm sorry, just to go through one last thing. Bishop takes queen here, e6, and queen e5, Fischer says is coming, which is a defensive move and an offensive move, threatening mate. So g4. And now a5, Fischer says Larsen is one move too late to win the game, or to get his counterattack going. Pawn to g5, knight to h5, and now this position you might want. I would actually, if I were you, because when I went through this game the first time, I've actually seen I've seen this game a bunch of times, but if you haven't seen this game before and you want a really good puzzle, you know, this would be a great thing to spend a half an hour calculating, or even an hour or 3 hours if you like to suffer. So, but if you could find the next move, even if you want to spend a minute trying to find the next move, pause it now. Okay, I'll go through it now. Fischer in the game, I'll just say, plays rook takes h5. And you should try to calculate that. I would set it up on a board. But we just want to go through a possible defense, and it's It's easier to look at the defenses once you've looked at the whole game. But we're going to look at 98 right now. Okay, A4 first we'll look at is even worse. Takes, threatening takes, queen takes C2 exclamation point. If rook takes C2, rook H8 mate, E5, queen H2 is winning. I'll believe that. So now let's look at 98. But Fischer says this is a winning variation. Bishop takes G7, knight takes G7. If king takes G7, queen H2. So knight takes G7, says rook H6 exclamation point. E6. Now he says if A4, queen H2, knight H5, rook takes G6 check is winning. I think in going through this game, in some of Fischer's other games, it just makes me think that Fischer, he must have done so many puzzles because he just spots these things really quickly. It seems like he's got a great instinct for tactics. So after E6, stopping the pin on the G8, A2 diagonal, queen H2, knight H5, bishop takes E6, exclamation point F takes E6, and now he says if queen takes G5, rook takes G6 check, queen takes G6. Oh, I'm sorry. Not rook G1, but bishop takes C8, and then also threatening rook G1 is winning, he says. So, not queen takes G5, F takes E6, rook takes G6 check, knight G7, rook H1, he says, etc. But I mean, like his analysis, he does make me think he's writing for people who are mostly chess masters. So I'm trying to explain some of it, and also just explain it for myself. So maybe after king F7, queen H7, here check and take the rook. So those were some of the variations he gives for defenses that don't work. But after knight H5, rook takes H5. This was the next move that I had trouble finding was after G takes H5, G6. And now I guess the Grandmaster Ruben Fine wrote of this position right here that in such positions combinations are as natural as a baby's smile. Okay, great. G takes H5, and Fischer says no better is bishop takes D4, queen takes D4, G takes H5, G6, queen E5. Says if E6, queen takes D6. Queen E5, G takes F7, king H7. So first he says if king F8, queen takes E5, G takes E5, rook G1, E6, bishop takes e6, king e7, bishop takes c8, rook takes c5, rook g5 wins. Because after king takes f7, rook takes h7, I think he says this is a winning endgame. Or, I'm sorry, rook takes e5, I think is better. Well, let's see. Rook h8 takes here. And I think the rook can catch the pawn, and I think it's safe to say that these pawns will win for white. So that's one variation. After king f8, so after g6, queen e5 takes, Fischer gives king to h7, queen to d3, intending f4 should be decisive, according to Fischer. So now we'll look at, I wish I knew how much he actually calculated in the game. I can imagine if I had a game like this and I played rook takes h5, I'd probably have a minute left on my clock, even if I started with 3 hours. So takes g6, e5. Now these variations I thought were the most interesting. We're on move 23, by the way. So if you're noting that the game ends in about 8 more moves, we're on move 23. So these variations I thought were the most interesting. And these are actually really good puzzles. So I would suggest if you want now to pause it and do another puzzle, but the video is more just for appreciating the tactics. And then also I think it's good to go through these. These have helped me because they make me more determined to calculate more in my games to see how much is actually being analyzed in the mind of a grandmaster. Is very helpful. So e6, g takes f7, king takes f7. Now Fischer says if rook takes f7, bishop takes e6, and I think in this position I think just losing the exchange is enough to. I think it's a variation where I think white's up in pawns and it's going to be even worse. King takes f7, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, rook g1 check, king h7, queen to g2. And now I think this was a question I had during the game is when I was first analyzing it, what if king to f7? And now I think queen to h6. Let's see. First, I think this loses. Checkmate. After king here. So that's not playable. How to stop checkmate? Let's see. Queen e5. Bishop takes e6. Rook g7 check. Seems pretty decisive. Because after, no matter where the king goes, it's mating. And after bishop takes e6, king f7. I think this is decisive. Even if it's just the queen that's won here. I think we can say that with so maybe this is a better way to do it. And whoops, I'm sorry, the queen's hanging. Check. This should be a winnable position if you guard the c2 pawn and maintain the attack on the king here. But this was something I thought was important to look at, was the king f7 variation. And I think bishop takes e6 is pretty decisive. I mean, this is even worse. Or maybe it's the same thing. So Fischer only gives the move king to h7, and obviously, well, king f8 is king h8 is even worse because check here, checkmate, and also I think it's kind of assumed king f8 allows this check as well. And the variations are not going to be pretty. But the combinations will be as natural as a baby's smile, according to Reuben Fine. So, okay, king to h7, because I mean I'm sure Fischer looked at king f7, but I just like to analyze as much as possible. And please, at any time, pause the video if you need to and set it up on a board, think it out. King h7, queen, okay, queen to g2, queen e5, queen to g6 check, king h8, rook to g5, and now here Fischer gives queen takes, oh no, not queen takes g5, rook to g7, rook takes h5 check, king to g8, bishop takes e6 check, king to f8, rook f5 check, king e7, rook f7 check wins. Now, I think, though, one problem that I had with this variation was after bishop takes, not here, but after rook h5 check, queen takes check, rook to h7, and I was confused as to why Fischer didn't analyze this in his analysis. Well, queen takes h7 is forced because the only check you have is on e5, and that's guarded, and also e8. So the mate on the square right here, there's no way to defend against it because of the pawn. So after rook here, this is forced, and now I assume this was winning. So maybe Fischer had looked at this and did not think it was worth going through. But this position could be a draw. But I think it's winning for white. So this was a variation. These are some variations given instead of the move pawn to e5 played in this position. So Larsen played pawn to e5 in the game. Now pawn takes f7 check, king f8, and I think rook takes is not played just because I think well, black's going for a win. So king f8, bishop e3, d5. Fischer says this was the last little trick black had in mind. a4 he also analyzes, and rook to d8. After rook to d8 he says bishop h6. And now this looks, well, bishop, so let's look at rook takes f7. Takes, check, picks up the rook. So rook takes f7. It's not good, and it's hard to find a defensive move here, because just of the threat of takes, and queen g5 check looks decisive. So now the other move he gives is a4, and queen takes d6 check. Rook e7, queen to d8 check. Rook takes d8. Rook e8, and now there's checkmate here, and it is not taking the rook because of queen takes, but actually I think this works too after bishop c5 check. I think, yeah, that's mate, but the other way to do it would, which is a little cooler looking, I suppose, is bishop c5, only move, rook takes mate. So just wanted to look at if this works for sure. Yes, this is mate. So, okay. So those were some other variations, but in the game, the move played was pawn to d5. Now he says e takes d5 exclamation point. Now he said if bishop takes d5, rook takes c2. And now rook takes f7 is played in the game, and now if a4, d6 exclamation point, and let's say if rook to d7, bishop e6 looks horrible, and a takes b3, takes is winning for white. So in the game, rook takes f7 was played because now the pawn is no longer defended. d6, rook f6, on rook to d7, Fischer says white can either regain the exchange with bishop e6, or keep on with the attack with bishop h6, and I myself would probably play the safer bishop e6. And also another move given is rook takes f3, and now he says d7 threatens queen to d6, which is mate because these squares are blocked off by the bishop. So after rook f6, which was played in the game, bishop to g5, queen to b7, and now I like this variation a lot. Queen to d7. This is not playing the game, but if it was, then queen to d5 exclamation point, queen to f7. This is the one I like. If rook to f7, bishop to e7 check is decisive. King e8, queen takes f7 mate, and if rook takes e7, queen g8 mate. So queen takes. This is also not going to work because if rook takes, it's mate. And after king takes, queen takes f7. So that was a pretty cool variation of queen to d7. But after queen to f7 here, Fischer gives this as winning material. So takes, and white is winning. Okay, so in the game, queen b7 was played. After bishop g5. So bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, d7, rook d8, and now Fischer says, see, this game, when I first looked at it, I loved it, and it really scared me because it's so complicated. But even Fischer says he makes a mistake, and he misses a better move. He plays queen to d6, and he said he missed a mate in 3 here, which was with queen to h6. And you think, how could he miss that after he saw every other move in the game? But he says this forces mate in 3. So let's see, after king e7, queen h7 check. He might have been in time trouble. If king f8, queen f7, and bishop g7 takes his mate. So after queen h6, bishop g7, queen d6 is mate, and so we can see this going through. The only 2 variations were king e7 and bishop g7, both lead to mate. You wonder how Fischer didn't see that, but either way, he saw as this is winning material. After after king to g7, rook to g1 check. And this looks decisive when the bishop's going to fall. So in this position, let's see, check, here, takes, and it's pretty much game over. So after queen to d6, Larsen resigned, and now I think this was a really great game of chess, especially given that it changed chess history and made people play the dragon less because Fischer destroyed them when they did. And also I think it's a good instructive game because there's a million puzzles in it, or maybe more. And also it just gives you a good idea of if you're trying to improve, which I assume you are if you're watching this video, that you have to be able to analyze chess in as many variations as possible. So this is a great game because it shows calculations, and also the exchange sacrifice rook takes h5 is a good example of, he might not have seen this whole thing through, but he had seen enough tactics and enough good intuition to make the move. And also I just want to analyze some other key points in the game, which we have to look at, is after rook ac8, which was now we can understand why this was seen as the losing move in the game, which sounds insane, to put it so plain. But we see that after bishop to b3, exclamation point, the power to save the 2 bishops is a decisive factor. The control on this, the g8, a2 diagonal was one thing that was one of the brilliancies of the game, and the tactics which followed bishop b3 on move 16 would not have been possible without having such an advantage of a strong bishop. And then lastly, I think that was all that I wanted to go through. So this is a great game of chess, and believe me, I've spent an hour just going through it right now. But I spent hours preparing for this lecture, and it was even when I didn't have this board set up, I was thinking about some of the variations in these lines, and I mean, like, one of the variations that Fischer gives is literally, like, some of the variations are literally 10 moves long, or 10 moves from each side. So they start on move like 23 and it gets to move 33. So it's really helpful to see how advanced chess is played, and it's a great game of chess.